On January 26, 1945, the fields outside Holtzwihr, France were frozen solid, an expanse of churned ice and shattered trees beneath a sky, the color of steel. Mid-afternoon light cut through drifting smoke, revealing a scene that defied every principle of warfare. From the tree line, German infantry emerged in disciplined rows, 250 seasoned mountain troops, veterans of brutal campaigns in Norway and the Eastern Front. 6 armored beasts, Panzer IVs and assault guns, rumbled behind them, their engines growling through the cold. They had broken countless defenses across Europe. What waited ahead of them should have been a minor obstacle, a few dozen exhausted Americans clinging to a patch of frozen forest. Tactically, it was supposed to be over in minutes. And yet, something impossible was unfolding. A single figure stood atop the smoking wreck of a tank destroyer. Black plumes rose around him as German artillery echoed across the valley. The man didn't retreat. Instead, he mounted the vehicle's .50 caliber machine gun, swung the heavy barrel toward the advancing formations, and opened fire. Tracer rounds carved red-hot lines through the snowstorm. German infantry dropped in waves, their attack faltering almost instantly. The tanks, suddenly without the shield of their foot soldiers, hesitated. Commander hatches cracked open, uncertain. Within minutes, what was designed as a perfectly coordinated assault began to unravel, stalled by one soldier who looked barely old enough to shave. Inside the forest, his men watched in stunned silence. He had ordered them to pull back. He stayed behind, alone. For an hour, he would hold that position, bleeding, surrounded, standing on a vehicle that could explode at any second. Artillery thundered dangerously close, snow whipped sideways, and German soldiers kept coming. But the lone American didn't yield. His stand would shatter enemy momentum, defy military logic, and be remembered long after the battlefield returned to quiet farmland. At that moment, he wasn't a name in history. He was just a 19-year-old Texan with frost in his hair and fire in his hands, facing an army that refused to believe one man could stop them. They were about to learn he could. Long before the snow of France and the thunder of artillery, there were the sun-baked fields of Hunt County, Texas. Audie Murphy was born there on June 20th, 1925, the 6th of 12 children in a family that owned almost nothing but their determination to survive. Their small house leaned against the wind, surrounded by cotton fields that stretched into the haze. Poverty wasn't a passing hardship. It was the air they breathed. Audie's father drifted between odd jobs and long absences, a quiet man who eventually walked away for good when Audie was 12. His mother, Josie, carried the burden alone, raising the children with little more than faith and grit. She fell ill and died in 1941, leaving 16-year-old Audie as the head of a family still full of hungry mouths. The boy who should have been worrying about school, now worried about food. Each bullet he fired from the family's worn .22 rifle had to count. A missed shot meant empty plates. A clean kill meant his brothers and sisters ate that night. Neighbors still remembered watching him bring down a rabbit mid-sprint from 50 yards, a feat that wasn't sport but necessity. "If I don't set hit what I aim at," he once told a neighbor, "we don't set eat." It wasn't set bravado, it was math. Those endless hunts forged something inside him: patience, precision, a coolness under pressure. He learned to move silently through brush, to blend into the land, to wait for the perfect instant to act, qualities that years later would turn German soldiers into silhouettes against a rifle sight. When America was pulled into war after Pearl Harbor, Audie saw a chance not for glory but survival. The Army promised 3 meals a day, steady pay, and a way to send money home. He rushed to enlist, but the world saw only a scrawny teenager, 5'5", barely 110 pounds. The Marines rejected him, so did the Navy. Even the paratroopers turned him away. But Audie was stubborn. With the help of his sister, who quietly adjusted his age on paper, He tried again. This time, the regular army took him. He wasn't motivated by patriotism alone. Beneath his quiet demeanor burned something older, the fierce instinct of a boy who had carried his family on his back. War, to him, wasn't a grand adventure. It was another kind of hunt, one with far higher stakes. As he boarded the train for basic training in 1942, his world shifted from the cotton fields of Texas to the vast machinery of war. He was still small, still young, but anyone who looked into his eyes saw a glint that didn't belong to a boy. It belonged to someone who had been forced to grow up too early and who had learned, long before the uniform, how to fight for survival. Camp Walters, Texas. A landscape of dust, barracks, and barking drill sergeants. When Audie Murphy arrived in the summer of 1942, he looked more like someone's kid brother than a future warrior. 5'5", slight build, baby-faced, he barely filled out the uniform hanging on his shoulders. Among the rows of fresh recruits, he stood out for all the wrong reasons. At first, the men thought he was a mascot. Some joked he'd taken a wrong turn on the way to high school. Instructors rode him mercilessly, calling him baby and daring him to keep up. The physical drills pushed everyone to exhaustion, but for Audie they were a daily battle to prove he belonged. But there was something different about him, something that became impossible to ignore the moment live ammunition came into play. On the rifle range, the teasing stopped. Recruits lined up, fumbling with their weapons, nervous under the instructor's watchful eyes. Audie stepped forward, calm, quiet. He raised his rifle, exhaled, and squeezed the trigger. One shot, then another. Each hit dead center. Not once, not twice, every time. His instructors watched as this boyish Texan treated marksmanship like second nature. No wasted movement, no hesitation. Just cold precision. Those long years hunting in silence had honed his senses sharper than any training manual could. He didn't aim, he calculated. Private David McClure, who bunked near him, later said, when he was behind that rifle, the whole camp changed. You stopped laughing, you just watched. Bit by bit, Audie stopped being the runt of the platoon and started becoming something else entirely. Respected, feared, even. Not for his size, but for the way his eyes went still when he focused on a target. Training didn't make him a soldier. It simply gave shape to the instincts he'd carried his whole life. By the time the company completed basic, the kid had become someone everyone wanted on their flank. The army had no idea yet, but a legend was beginning to take form. July 1943, Sicily. The air was thick with heat and the smell of diesel. The Mediterranean sun beating down as American landing craft nosed toward the rocky shore. Company B of the 15th Infantry Regiment came ashore near Licata, part of Patton's bold push into Axis territory. For many, this was their first glimpse of war. For Audie Murphy, it was the beginning of something that would change him forever. The mountains inland were no welcoming ground. Jagged ridges and narrow passes turned every patrol into a nerve-wracking climb. German and Italian troops were waiting, dug in, confident that these green Americans would falter. At first, Murphy moved cautiously, eyes scanning the terrain the way he once scanned the Texas brush for game. Then the shooting started, and the boy from Hunt County vanished. Pinned down by a machine gun nest outside Palermo, Murphy's unit was moments from disaster. Bullets chewed into rocks and dry earth, trapping them in place. While others hugged the ground, Audie studied the angles, found a gap in the enemy's flank, and slipped away unnoticed. He crept through brush, silent as he had once stalked rabbits, and got behind the nest. A quick pull of the grenade pin, a toss, and the gun fell silent. He didn't stop there. Grabbing the enemy weapon, he turned it on the retreating defenders, cutting them down with brutal efficiency. It wasn't rage that drove him. It was clarity, a cold, precise focus. Officers who witnessed the attack recommended him for the Bronze Star. The citation praised his extraordinary aptitude for combat. But those who were there remembered something else: how calm he'd been. Murphy wasn't transformed overnight. War chipped at him bit by bit. He learned how to move unseen, how to hit fast and vanish before the enemy could react. His marksmanship, born of hunger in Texas fields, now became a weapon that terrified veteran soldiers across 3 countries. By autumn, during the brutal fighting along Italy's rivers and hills, his reputation began to spread. At the Volturno River crossing, his squad was cut apart by a German counterattack. Alone and exposed, Murphy picked up a borrowed sniper rifle and went to work. One by one, 5 German soldiers fell at ranges that left even seasoned marksmen shaking their heads. His fire broke the counterattack and saved what was left of the unit. Staff Sergeant William Polson later tried to explain it. Murphy didn't set fight angry. That's what made him frightening. He fought like he was solving an equation. One target, then the next, then the next. No emotion, just certainty. War had shown him what he was capable of, and it wasn't heroics in the traditional sense. It was survival, sharpened to a razor's edge. The young man who had once hunted to feed his siblings was now hunting to keep his brothers in arms alive. By the end of the Italian campaign, Murphy had already begun to change. He'd killed men, saved others, and discovered that under fire, his mind became frighteningly clear. He wasn't just surviving the war, he was thriving in it. Though the cost of that clarity would follow him long after the guns went silent. Winter 1944. The Italian front had become a place where time lost meaning. At Anzio, the sea and land blurred into one endless battlefield, a beachhead soaked in blood and churned mud. Artillery shells fell day and night without pattern, like some cruel god rolling dice. For months, soldiers lived in trenches that flooded, froze, and killed. It was here, amid the chaos, that Audie Murphy's legend began to take shape. During one assault, a German tank pushed dangerously close to American lines, its cannons smashing through defensive positions. Murphy didn't wait for orders. He grabbed a bazooka, crawled forward under machine gun fire, and emerged less than 30 feet from the steel monster. One well-placed rocket at point-blank range ended the threat. He earned his first Silver Star for that action, though those who saw it swore the citation didn't capture half of what it took to walk toward a tank alone. The fighting at Anzio hardened him. Each day chipped away the remnants of youth, replacing them with something colder, steadier. By the time Allied forces broke out of the beachhead and pushed north, Murphy was no longer just the talented marksman from Texas. He was becoming a soldier. Others followed instinctively. Months later, August 1944, southern France. The invasion swept ashore like a tide of steel. Murphy came with the 3rd Infantry Division, moving inland through villages shattered by war. His uniform was patched, his face older than his 19 years, and his reputation had already reached both sides of the line. German soldiers had begun to recognize his unit's presence with unease. American soldiers, meanwhile, had learned to trust that if Murphy was nearby, their odds of surviving improved. That trust was tested near Montelimar. His platoon was ambushed, their lieutenant killed in the first exchange. German forces, more than 100 men, closed in, with only 18 soldiers under his command. Murphy seized control. He positioned his men strategically at a crossroads, barking calm, precise orders over the gunfire. For 2 brutal hours they held off wave after wave, Murphy personally accounting for 15 enemy dead. When the smoke cleared, the road remained in American hands. Leadership wasn't something he had sought. It emerged naturally, forged in desperation, and tempered by the quiet authority that only comes from surviving what others fear. His superiors noticed on October 14, 1944, he received a battlefield commission to 2nd lieutenant. The boy who had once been dismissed as too small to fight was now leading men into battles that shaped the fate of Europe. Those who served beside him didn't speak of glory. They spoke of the way he moved through chaos, as if the world slowed for him. In Anzio's mud and southern France's hills, Murphy crossed the invisible line between fighter and leader. And from that point on, he was no longer just part of the war. He was shaping it. January 1945. The war in Europe was nearing its bloody end. But no one on the frozen plains of Alsace could feel victory. The Colmar pocket, a stubborn German bridgehead west of the Rhine, was holding fast, defended by some of Hitler's most seasoned troops. For the men of Company B, 3rd Infantry Division, the assignment was brutally simple: hold the line in conditions that seemed designed to break human beings. Snow lay thick across the fields, masking shell holes and barbed wire beneath an icy crust. Wind slashed through overcoats, carrying the distant rumble of tank engines like a warning. The forests were skeletal, their branches shattered by artillery, and foxholes froze solid before they could be finished. Every night temperatures plunged, turning rifles brittle and boots into blocks of ice. In just 5 days of grinding combat, Company B had lost over 100 men to wounds, frostbite, or death. Officers were dead or evacuated. From a full-strength company of nearly 200, only 40 effectives remained, and even they were running on the fumes of sleepless nights and cold K-rations. Murphy himself carried a piece of shrapnel in his leg from a skirmish 2 days earlier, but he told no one. Pain was just another element of the landscape. Private Anthony Abramsky later described those days simply, "We were done." Nobody said it out loud, but we knew. Frostbite, no sleep, half the guns freezing up. It wasn't said a question of if the Germans would hit us again. It was when. The enemy facing them was no rabble. Elements of the elite 2nd Mountain Division, veterans of brutal campaigns in Norway, had been rushed in to defend the last German stronghold on French soil. Hitler's orders were clear: hold Colmar at all costs. These were soldiers trained for winter warfare, well-equipped and desperate. The Americans were exhausted, undersupplied, and exposed along the forest edge. Murphy surveyed the terrain carefully. He knew an assault would come through the open fields between their position and the village of Holtzwihr. He positioned his thin line of troops as best he could, anchoring their defense on 2 Men-10 tank destroyers, one of the few assets they had left. His command post was a shallow drainage ditch, offering little more than a decent view and a telephone line to distant artillery batteries. If the Germans attacked in force, artillery would be their only real hope. In those gray mornings, the silence before the storm felt heavier than the snow itself. Murphy, just 19, had already seen more death than most men twice his age. But even he understood that what was coming next would test them in ways no training could prepare for. The winter was closing in, and so was the enemy. Dawn broke gray and bitter on January 26, 1945. The fields before Holtzwihr were a frozen wasteland, crusted with snow and churned by weeks of artillery. In the forest's ragged edge, the remnants of Company B crouched behind makeshift defenses, breath misting in the air, like smoke from tired engines. Murphy scanned the horizon from his shallow command ditch. The air was too still. He knew what that meant. At exactly 1300 hours, the silence shattered. German artillery erupted in a pounding barrage that hammered the treetops, sending splinters and steel raining down like shrapnel storms. Shells burst overhead, detonating among the branches, scattering hot fragments across foxholes that offered little protection. Men hugged the earth, hands over their helmets, waiting for the blasts to end. 30 minutes felt like hours. Then, as the barrage tapered off, the ground began to tremble. 6 German tanks rolled out of the morning haze, their antennae streaming small flags, armor-coated with frost. Behind them, wave upon wave of infantry in white winter camouflage advanced across the open ground. 250 men moved in perfect discipline, a ghostly tide sweeping toward the forest. "Here they come," someone muttered, almost reverently. Murphy reacted instantly, grabbing the field phone and calling for artillery. Within minutes, American shells began to land across the advancing lines, erupting columns of smoke and dirt. But the Germans kept coming. They were too many, too spread out, their attack too well drilled. Artillery alone wouldn't stop them. At 600 yards, Company B's only real anti-tank weapons, two M10 tank destroyers, opened fire. Their first shots went wide. The crews were exhausted and half-frozen. German gunners returned fire with chilling accuracy. An 88 shell slammed into the rear M10's turret, turning it into a fireball. The crew barely escaped before the vehicle was consumed in flames. The second destroyer tried to reposition for a clearer shot, but the frozen ground betrayed it. The tracks slipped, the vehicle lurched sideways into a drainage ditch, and there it stayed, useless. Its crew abandoned it under fire and scrambled back to the woods. Murphy saw what was happening. German infantry were closing fast within 200 yards, and their tanks were preparing to push straight through. He made a decision in seconds that would define his life. He turned to his men. "Fall back to the tree line," he ordered. "Hold the secondary position." They hesitated. Leaving the front line meant abandoning him, but he was already moving, sprinting through artillery smoke toward the burning tank destroyer. Flames roared from its rear deck. The heat was fierce even from a distance. Ammunition inside could blow at any moment. Yet that was exactly where he was headed. As his soldiers withdrew into the woods, glancing back over their shoulders, they saw their 19-year-old lieutenant climb onto the flaming wreck. Smoke curled around him like a black halo. German bullets cracked through the air. The assault had begun, and Audie Murphy was walking straight into its heart. Murphy hauled himself onto the burning Mine 10, boots slipping on steel slick with snow and oil. Flames roared from the rear deck where an 88 shell had pierced the fuel tank. Black smoke coiled skyward, stinging his eyes and filling the air with the bitter tang of burning gasoline. He could feel the heat through his uniform. One spark, one misfire, and the whole vehicle could erupt beneath him. He climbed anyway. He swung the heavy point .50 caliber Browning machine gun toward the advancing German infantry. From this perch, he had an unobstructed view of the field, a deadly stage where hundreds of soldiers in white camouflage were fanning out toward the forest. Their tanks rumbled behind them, iron beasts preparing to crush what remained of Company B. Then he opened fire. The Browning thundered, its deep, mechanical rhythm cutting through the battlefield like a drumbeat of defiance. Tracer rounds ripped across the snow, glowing arcs that found their marks with terrifying precision. German soldiers dropped in groups, momentum shattering as the front ranks crumpled. Those behind hesitated, suddenly aware that the blazing wreck they dismissed was now spitting death. Inside the forest, Murphy's men watched, transfixed. Their lieutenant stood alone on a burning vehicle, silhouetted against a haze of smoke and snow, cutting down enemy infantry with mechanical efficiency. "I'd never seen anything like it," Private Abramsky recalled. He wasn't fighting like a man trying to survive. He was fighting like someone who had decided this was the place he'd make his stand. The Germans regrouped quickly, splitting into assault teams to flank the wreck. Murphy tracked them methodically. Each time a group broke cover, the Browning barked again, stitching lines of fire through the drifts. He wasn't spraying wildly. Every burst was measured, deliberate. His years of hunting, his combat experience, everything converged into a single terrifying clarity. Meanwhile, he kept the field phone cradled under his arm, calling in artillery strikes even as he fired. Shells began to crash around the advancing infantry, throwing up geysers of frozen earth. The bombardment landed dangerously close, but Murphy adjusted with surgeon-like precision, bringing down artillery on any formation that dared to mass for an assault. Together, his gunfire and the supporting barrages formed an invisible wall the Germans could not cross. Minutes, stretched into something timeless. Smoke thickened. Snow whipped sideways in gusts. The barrel of the Browning glowed red, spent casings piling like brass snowdrifts at his feet. German fire converged on him. Rifles, machine guns, even tank coaxials, but the combination of smoke, elevation, and sheer audacity kept him alive. Technical Sergeant Wald, watching through binoculars from the rear, later said he wasn't set just shooting, he was hunting. Squad after squad tried to flank, and he picked them off like he was at a shooting gallery. At around 1500 hours, after 40 minutes of continuous firing, Murphy's ammunition began to run low. The gun's roar faltered. German infantry, sensing the change, crept closer, some within 10 yards of the burning hull. Shrapnel from incoming artillery tore through his leg, hot pain lancing up through the cold. He barely noticed. Then, he made the most desperate call of the fight. Murphy ordered artillery to fire directly on his own position. Lieutenant Weiss, the forward observer, hesitated. Such a barrage would almost certainly kill him. Murphy didn't. Fire on me. Now, he barked. It wasn't bravado. It was calculation. If they didn't break the assault here, the forest line would fall. Moments later, the shells came in. Explosions rocked the field, detonating frighteningly close to the M10. Frozen mud and shrapnel rained over everything. German soldiers caught in the open were shredded. Others broke, retreating in panic from the maelstrom. Murphy stayed on the Browning, blood running down his leg, firing short bursts between impacts. Finally, the attack began to crumble. Infantry formations melted away, retreating toward Holtzwihr. The tanks, stripped of their support, and facing incoming artillery, reversed course. Within minutes, the once unstoppable German advance disintegrated into a chaotic withdrawal. For nearly an hour, one 19-year-old lieutenant had held back an entire company with nothing but a machine gun, artillery, and sheer will. When the field finally fell silent, Murphy climbed down from the smoking tank destroyer. His uniform was scorched, his face blackened with soot. The snow around the wreck was littered with bodies, churned earth, and spent brass. He limped back toward the tree line where his men waited, wide-eyed and speechless. He didn't say a word. He just asked if anyone had been hit by the artillery he'd called in. Then sat down, lit a cigarette with shaking hands, and stared through the smoke at the battlefield he had just single-handedly changed. When the last echoes of artillery faded, a strange silence descended on the battlefield. The forest seemed to exhale after an hour of relentless violence. Smoke drifted low over the churned snow, curling around shattered trees and the burning hulk of the American 10. In the distance, the sound of retreating engines marked the end of the German assault. They were gone. Murphy limped through the wreckage, his leg bleeding, his uniform scorched. The snow beneath his boots was littered with shell fragments, empty casings, and the still shapes of enemy soldiers. Historians would later estimate that 50 Germans had been killed in the assault, with many more wounded. The tanks that had once promised to crush Company B now sat immobilized in the distance, their crews unwilling to advance without infantry support that no longer existed. His men emerged cautiously from the tree line, stunned by what they saw. It was like walking onto another world. One private remembered the field was silent, except for the crackling of the burning tank. Everything else was still. The Germans had retreated in disorder, their coordinated offensive shattered by a single defender. They left behind bodies, weapons, and their confidence. Even their elite mountain troops, seasoned veterans from Norway and the Eastern Front, had broken against Murphy's stand. What followed was just as remarkable as the battle itself: almost total silence in German records. Military archivists would spend decades combing through division diaries, after-action reports, and personal testimonies. They found barely a mention of the engagement. The official entry from the German 2nd Mountain Division for January 26th was terse: attack on American positions near Holtzwihr, repulsed with heavy casualties. Resistance heavier than expected. That dry sentence hid the chaos that had actually unfolded. Several factors likely explain the void. Many of the German soldiers who witnessed Murphy's stand didn't survive it. Others were caught in a retreat that left little time for documentation. Some records were deliberately destroyed as the war's end approached, erasing embarrassing defeats from history. Yet their silence spoke volumes. Murphy's defiance hadn't just stopped a tactical assault, it had struck something deeper. Elite troops who had fought across Europe encountered, for the first time, a lone soldier who fought with a ferocity that defied their doctrine. Their attack didn't just fail, it unraveled. Strategically, the consequences were immediate. By holding the line, Murphy allowed the 3rd Infantry Division to maintain its grip on the forest approaches to Holtzwihr. The German failure to break through sealed the fate of the Colmar pocket. Within weeks, the last German bridgehead west of the Rhine would collapse, taking 50,000 troops out of the war. As night fell, Company B prepared for another attack that never came. The Germans had no stomach for a second attempt. In the quiet that followed, they realized they'd witnessed something that defied logic, mathematics, and military science. One man altering the course of a battle, Murphy's one-man stand outside Holtzwihr rippled far beyond that frozen field. In purely tactical terms, his defense halted the German counterattack long enough for the 3rd Infantry Division to maintain control of the forest approaches. That position was the key to the Colmar pocket, the last German foothold on French soil west of the Rhine. When their assault collapsed, the German forces lost their final chance to stabilize the front in Alsace. Over the following weeks, Allied units closed in like tightening jaws. Holtzwihr fell the next day to the 30th Infantry Regiment, and the Colmar pocket itself collapsed within a month. 50,000 German troops were captured or killed, and the way was cleared for the Allied armies to push into Germany. What Murphy achieved in that hour didn't just save his company, it accelerated the end of German resistance in the region. The U.S. Army recognized the scale of his actions swiftly. On June 2, 1945, near Salzburg, Austria, Audie Murphy received the Medal of Honor from Lieutenant General Alexander Patch. The language of the citation, formal and restrained as military documents tend to be, struggled to fully express the scale of what he had done. Alone and exposed to fire from 3 sides, he inflicted severe casualties on the attacking force, causing its attack to waver. For an hour, the enemy tried every weapon to eliminate him, but he held his position. For the men who had watched it unfold, those words were almost comically understated. They'd seen him transform a burning wreck into a fortress and stop an entire company in its tracks. In military academies, analysts began to dissect his actions not as legend, but as tactical study. His fusion of heavy machine gun fire and close artillery coordination became a textbook example of how a well-placed defender could neutralize overwhelming force. French commanders were equally impressed. General Jean de Lattre de Tassigny, leader of the French First Army, declared that Murphy's defense broke the back of German resistance in Alsace. In 2000, long after the war ended, the 3rd Infantry Division was granted the honor of wearing the French fourragère, a braided cord recognizing extraordinary valor, partly in tribute to the actions at Holtzwihr. On the battlefield itself, the French erected a memorial where the stand had taken place. Each January, veterans, villagers, and historians gather at the marker to remember the young American who had changed the course of their history. The surrounding fields are peaceful now, quiet farmland once again. But beneath the soil lie the scars of that frozen day in 1945. Murphy's legacy was more than medals or monuments. His actions shaped tactical thinking, inspired soldiers for generations, and symbolized something deeper, that in war, courage and will can outweigh numbers and firepower. His stand became a touchstone in military education, a story recounted not just for inspiration, but for the lessons it taught about leadership under unimaginable pressure. When the guns finally fell silent, Audie Murphy's war was far from over. The young Texan who had faced down tanks and infantry returned home carrying wounds that no metal could mend. Night after night, he woke screaming, trapped in the same frozen fields he'd conquered years before. Sleep became a battlefield of its own. Darkness reminded him too much of night patrols, so he often retreated to the garage, pistol at his side, lights blazing against memories he couldn't shut out. His first marriage collapsed under the weight of those invisible scars. Friends recalled how he could be warm and charming during the day, only to become restless and haunted when night came. Long before PTSD entered public vocabulary, Murphy lived its reality. But rather than hide it, he eventually began to speak openly, using his fame to bring attention to veterans who suffered in silence. In 1966, he wrote candidly about nightmares and hypervigilance, warning that thousands returning from Vietnam would face similar struggles without proper help. His advocacy helped push forward early mental health programs for soldiers. Historians later analyzed his legendary stand not just through emotion but through cold numbers. The Browning M2 he used could fire over 500 rounds a minute and punch through armor. Artillery shells he directed exploded dangerously close to his position, amplifying his firepower exponentially. In roughly an hour, German forces fired an estimated 10,000 rounds at him. Statistically, he shouldn't have survived. His combination of marksmanship, terrain advantage, and sheer will turned a burning vehicle into an unbreakable fortress. Modern military experts still study that battle. They debate whether a similar feat could happen in today's age of drones and satellites. Most agree that while technology has changed, the essence of combat, the collision of human willpower, remains. In Iraq and Afghanistan, stories of lone soldiers holding the line echo Murphy's defiance, proving that courage isn't bound by era. Murphy's medals filled display cases, 33 decorations, including every major U.S. combat award, but his most enduring legacy lives elsewhere. His honesty about trauma helped destigmatize psychological wounds. Hospitals and veteran programs now bear his name, a testament not just to his heroism in war, but to his impact in peace. Today, the field outside Holtzwihr is quiet farmland. Each January, veterans and villagers gather at a stone memorial to remember the teenager who stopped an army. His story endures because it speaks to something timeless, that a single person driven by loyalty and love for those beside them can stand against impossible odds. The boy who once hunted rabbits to feed his siblings became the man who faced an army to protect his friends and then spent the rest of his life trying to help others heal from the cost of war.